Good afternoon. I'm Richard Gigline. Thank you for joining our first Compensation Committee webinar of 2017. A new year often brings change, and this one is certainly no exception, as we wait to see what may be in store for American corporations under the new administration and how board decisions and governance might be impacted. When it comes to directors and director pay, the last couple of years have seen an increase in media and activist community attention, although the fundamental way boards are paid has not really changed significantly. Today, we are joined by director compensation experts Jan Coors and Tim Dupuy of Pearl Meyer. Jan is head of the firm's Chicago office, and she and her colleagues there spearhead the annual Pearl Meyer and NACD Director Compensation Report. Their research includes year-over-year changes and helps identify current practices and emerging trends in board pay. We'll review their findings and take your questions at the end of the program. For those of you who may have been having some difficulty downloading, please know that the slides will be sent to you following the presentation in attachment to an email. And I'd like to now turn over to Renell before we look at the numbers with the NACD, Renell Perry with NACD's education team, who has a few brief housekeeping announcements. Renell?
Thank you, Richard, and Happy New Year. Audience, you can submit a question and receive your answer directly from Pearl Meyer. You will also be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from our partner, Pearl Meyer. Please remember that you can tweet live during the event today with NACD and Pearl Meyer. Presentation and slides are available at pearlmeyer.com/director-compensation-2017 and within the console. Also, NACD will follow up with an additional email with these resources available. Please remember that you will automatically receive one NACD skill credit for your participation. You have to be logged in for 30 minutes or longer. The credit may be applied to your NACD fellowship, and if you'd like more information about the fellowship, please email the address on the screen. Remember, a replay and slides will be available early next week at nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. Jan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Renell, and welcome everybody to our annual discussion of director compensation. Before we get into the actual compensation data, let me just sort of set the stage for the study so that everybody understands the basis upon which our analysis has been done. We look every year at a group of 1,400 companies, and we're pulling proxy statement data from 1,400 publicly traded companies. So all of our analysis is based on U.S. headquartered companies, publicly traded companies. We split them up for purposes of our presentation here into 5 size buckets, and we manage the participation or the companies that we look at such that they are a relatively similarly sized. So we've got the largest companies, sort of your Fortune 200 companies at the top. Then we have 4 smaller size buckets that are categorized by annual revenue. A large bucket that is companies with revenues of $2.5 billion to $10 billion, a medium group that is revenues with $1 to $2.5 billion, small, which is companies with half $500 million to $1 billion in revenues, and then the micro companies, the smallest group we look at, which are companies that have annual revenues between $50 million and $500 million. In the appendix of the report, which will be available when we publish all of the data with the NACD in the coming weeks, we also break this data out by 24 different industries based on GICS codes. So that's the basis upon which we do the analysis. So all of the data that you're seeing, that you'll see and that we'll walk through for the remainder of this webcast will be based on those 5 size categories of publicly traded companies. So having set the stage in terms of the companies that we're looking at for our analysis, let me give you a sense of what the boards look like and kind of how we've seen that evolve over time. So the median board number of board members on the companies sort of ranges from 7 at the smallest companies up to about 11 at the top 200 companies. The vast majority of companies have moved to a declassified board. So that's a board where every board member is elected by shareholders every single year. So that's that second row on this chart that shows the percent of companies with a 1-year term. The larger the company is, the more likely it is that they would have a declassified board. When you look at the top 200, it is virtually all of the top 200 have declassified their boards, very few exceptions there. Smaller the company, the more likely you are to still have a classified board. The way a classified board works is you've typically got 1/3 of the board members would be up for election every year. So every year they're serving a 3-year term and then getting reelected at the end of that 3-year term. Median age for directors and median tenure for directors. Median age is 64 years. Median tenure in aggregate is about 8.5 years. Ranges a little bit from a low of about 7.5 to a high of about 9. Those numbers have held fairly steady this year. We didn't see a lot of movement either in median age or median tenure. So notwithstanding all of the talk that we see around the focus on board refreshment, either on a voluntary basis or on a mandatory basis, the data would suggest that there hasn't been a lot of movement in this, at least not enough movement statistically to move median prevalence on either one of those numbers. Which brings us to the next question on the mandatory retirement. The number of companies with mandatory retirement also tends to increase based on company size. So again, if you look at the top 200 companies, about a little over 80% of them have some kind of mandatory retirement. We only show the median retirement age because that is far and away the most prevalent form of retirement in the U.S., while certainly other countries outside of the U.S. will tend to use a board term limit to cause refreshment. That is not the preferred approach for most U.S. companies. The majority of U.S. companies focus on retirement age rather than a term limit. So at the top 200, we see about a little over 80% of companies that have some kind of mandatory retirement program. But if you go down the scale to the smaller companies, our smallest group, that micro group, so companies with less than 500 million in revenues, only about 1/4 of those companies have any kind of mandatory retirement. Again, mandatory retirement age where we see it tends to be 72. Again, the smaller companies will push that up a little bit to 73, 74, 75. These numbers, too, haven't really moved much over the past year. So again, despite the focus on board refreshment and boards thinking about ways that they can encourage refreshment, we haven't seen companies move a lot in this direction such that it's moving this, that it's statistically significant. The other thing we look at with regard to board composition is board gender, as again in the same way we've had a focus around board refreshment. Part of the reason for that focus on board refreshment is to make room for additional increased diversity on boards. And every year we see these numbers move a little bit, so 1 or 2 percentage points in each of the 3 categories. How many companies have at least 1 woman on the board? How many companies have at least 2 women on the board? How many companies have at least 3 women on the board? And excuse me, Darian. We are now at a point where the majority of companies have at least, the vast majority of companies have at least one woman on the board, even at the smaller companies where you tend to see less gender diversity. More than 50% of the micro companies have at least 1 woman on the board. But these numbers are still, well below kind of a diversity that reflects the most companies' employee populations or their customer base, or just population in general. So there's some work to do to continue to do on this. Every year the numbers get a little better, but the numbers get a little better by 1 or 2 percentage points. And then the last thing we looked at here is the number of companies that still have a combined CEO and chairman of the board role, as opposed to having those 2 roles separate. And this is one of those areas that you see kind of a counter practice in terms of the trends. Like in most of these things we've talked about, the things that are deemed to be good governance, and I'll put that in quotes, you tend to see adopted more readily the larger the company is, not the smaller the company is. And in fact, good governance experts would suggest that it is better to have the CEO and chairman of the board roles separated. And this is the one area where, in fact, the larger companies, the top 200 companies, actually are less likely to have split the chairman and CEO role than smaller companies are. So it's a little, this is where, in fact, the smaller companies tend to lead the way in terms of what's considered to be good governance, and the larger companies tend to lag behind that a little bit. So I think that's interesting. And with that as kind of a background, we're going to move to our first polling question to get a sense of what people in the audience do. And we're going to focus on the mandatory retirement refreshment issue. So our first polling question is, which of the following does your board have in place to promote board refreshment? Do you have mandatory retirement age and or term limits? Do you have acceleration of equity vesting at retirement? Do you have both of those things, or do you have neither of those things? I think there are a number of ways, and Richard, I'd be curious as what you see in your board work as we give people a chance to kind of click the right button for them, what you see in your board work in terms of mandatory retirement age or term limits, and how you see that play out in discussions amongst your fellow board members.
Well, certainly the mandatory retirement age is, I think, absolutely the norm. I'm not sure that I actually agree with that as an approach. I think a better approach would be to have, as you think about the demographic profile of our population, the board age is potentially going to get younger and younger. Would you want somebody to come on your board at 30 or 35 years of age and be there until they're 72 or 75? I think that's pushing it.
I wouldn't think so.
I wouldn't either. So it seems to me that maybe a combination of age and or number of years might be a better approach to that. In terms of the acceleration of equity vesting, I keep seeing a trend, which I think is very good, that directors are required to hold a significant amount of equity relative to their compensation and hold it until they leave the board. And I think, personally, I think that's what should happen. I don't believe they should be out there moving off of their equity positions. They ought to be riding that equity just like they're there for the time they're on that board, and how the company does is how they will do.
And we're gonna touch on stock ownership guidelines and holding requirements a little bit later in the slides. But certainly you're right. There is definitely a continued trend in that direction. So as we look at the group on the phone, just less than half, 46% of the people on the phone are on boards where there is either a mandatory retirement age or a term limit. But at the other end of the spectrum, 42%, 43% don't do either one. They don't have any kind of limitations. They don't have any kind of accelerated vesting, so nothing programmatic that would encourage board refreshment. So, which brings me to my second polling question, which is, kind of that's the carrot, if you will, around those two things, carrots and sticks when you try to talk about how you encourage people to do things. The other thing that we wanted to talk about with regard to refreshment is the role that kind of succession planning has. So does your board have formal processes in place to address the following: director succession planning, annual evaluations of individual directors? So that second choice isn't around do you do committee self-evaluations or full board self-evaluations, but you actually do evaluations of individual director performance. And then the third and fourth alternative choices here are, yes, we actually do both of those things. We do director succession planning and we do individual performance evaluations for directors. Or fourth, we don't do either one of those things in any kind of formal way. I know, Richard, that you are a big fan. I'm going to call you out on this one. I know you're a big fan of individual performance evaluations for directors, but they can be tricky.
I am a big fan of it, and I think it's something that sort of, in some ways, maybe perversely, it is the one thing that seems to get a lot of pushback by an awful lot of directors. For some reason, they think it's absolutely mandatory, absolutely important that the C-suite and management down through the organization go through a 360 evaluation process, but they don't seem to think that's appropriate for them. And I think that's really wrong. I think the key is potentially doing it in such a way that everybody can respond to their 360 evaluation of their fellow directors anonymously, so no one knows exactly what you said about your compatriots on the board, but that the information is then brought together by a third party so that you really do understand how you as an individual director stack up against your compatriots and vice versa. I think that's something we really ought to put into our corporate governance programs without question.
Well, let's see if everybody on the phone agrees with you. See, you've still got some proselytizing to do on this one, Richard.
I knew that.
Director succession planning is at about 26%, so about a quarter of the folks on the phone have a formal succession planning process for their directors. Only about 10% do individual director evaluations. 26%. So there's clearly an overlap between those companies that have succession planning and the companies that are doing individual director evaluations, because the companies that do both are at a 27%, and then 37% say they don't do either one of those things in a formal way. So I think clearly as companies continue to struggle with how do you refresh the board, how do you address concerns around tenure, around diversity, around skills requirements as companies and business strategies change. How do you make sure that the board changes as well? These kinds of things are going to continue to get attention in the boardroom. And with that, I am going to shift the slides over to my colleague, Tim. He's going to now walk us through the compensation data. So once now we've kind of talked about the directors that we're looking at, Tim will walk us through the data on how those directors get paid. Tim?
Okay, thanks, Jan. On this slide, we're looking at the year-over-year changes in total direct compensation. So really the all-in value that a director receives every year. Over the prior year, we saw total direct compensation grow by 3% across all participants in our survey. When we look at the increases by size, we saw low to mid-single-digit increases across all size companies. And this trend has, as you can see here, really been in place for the past several years, really all the way back to 2010, where we saw some pretty significant increases as companies were coming out of the recession and had a little more money to spend. We did see a 1% decrease this year in medium companies. That's really an anomaly in the data. What happened there is we actually had a larger than normal change in the constituent companies that made up the medium size category. So we don't expect to see that necessarily in future years. Despite the uncertainty surrounding our recent administration change, we really do anticipate that we'll continue to see very modest increases in the low single to mid-digit increases over the next several years. When we take a deeper dive and look at the year-over-year changes by compensation element, we notice a few things. One, we saw a decrease in board meeting fees across most size companies. And if you've been following our report for the past couple of years, you'll see that this has been a trend that's continuing this year and has carried over from the past several years. Another trend that we've talked a lot about over the last several years is that we continually see companies decreasing committee compensation. And so this year across all companies, we saw a 7% decrease relative to the prior year. When we see companies that are eliminating committee compensation, most often they're eliminating committee meeting fees, and they tend to replace those with some other element of board compensation. So they're either providing increases to the annual cash retainer or the annual stock award. And this is really confirmed by the modest increases that we're seeing in board service compensation really across the board and across all size companies. Finally, although we saw average total direct compensation increase for most directors, we also noticed that when we look at total direct compensation on a per meeting basis, we see that the TDC on a per meeting basis has actually decreased. And what this is indicating to us is that boards and or committees are meeting more frequently in the past, most likely due to increased responsibility and the fact that more and more work is being done at the board and committee level.
Yeah, this is one of the things it's not something that typically gets reported or typically gets talked about that much. A lot of companies have gotten rid of meeting fees. I personally am a fan of getting rid of meeting fees. But I do think it's just interesting that, what this tells me is that, while as director pay keeps going up, part of the rationale that it's going up isn't just because everybody should get a raise every year. It's really around the fact that, boards are demonstrably doing more work. than they've done in the past, and so yeah, board members should be compensated for their time. I thought it was a really interesting little tidbit in the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me go back to the 3% increase in director compensation. Interesting question has just come in. Do any companies limit increases in board compensation to the overall increase in total employee compensation?
I don't know
That's
about
really
you, Jan, but
not to my knowledge.
Mine either, but there's been a lot of discussion that and stuff written about whether companies should try and tie, the top end with the bottom end, and if it's 3% for everybody, then it ought to be 3% for the C-suites, et cetera.
I've got some thoughts, but Tim, you were going to say something too.
No, I was going to say, if companies are thinking about that, it's not something that I've necessarily heard, and it's not something that I've often seen reported or in a company's public documentation.
Yeah, and I think it is a really, especially as you think about kind of some of the rhetoric that we heard. We heard more broadly, kind of politically, over the past 18 months or so. The focus on broad issues of inequality, et cetera. I think it's a really interesting concept. I think that there's a little bit of apples and oranges that companies would have to be careful around. Companies for employees have merit budget increases every single year. Year in, year out, and this is going to segue nicely into our next polling question. Director compensation doesn't go up every year. It doesn't work like employee pay does. So if you were going to say, well, you can't have a director pay go up more than employee pay goes up, well, what happens when director pay hasn't been changed in 5 years or 6 years? Right. Does that mean that director pay gets to go up by the cumulative merit budget pool for those 5 or 6 years? So now I can give my directors a 20% increase in one fell swoop.
And that would certainly go over well.
I get the question, and I get where it's going, but I think practical implementation would be tougher than it sounds.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so that does lead us nicely into our next polling question. And our third polling question is, when was the last time you made significant changes to your director compensation program? Was it last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or more than 3 years ago? So I think we've shown in the trend numbers and the data on the prior pages that companies really continue to make modest increases in aggregate to their director compensation programs on an annual basis. And that's really consistent with a lot of my client work, where even though companies may have us review their director comp programs every year or every other year, they're not necessarily making changes that often. I would say most often, in my experience, companies are making changes every 2 or 3 years when the market has moved enough to really warrant a change, or business conditions have changed enough to warrant a change. Jan or Richard, I'd be interested to see if you've had any different experiences.
Yeah, I think I agree with kind of your timing, that we'll see how the folks on the line play this out. But the other thing I think that I hear directors being sensitive about when they say, do we make a change this year or not, is how did the company perform this year? And I find that directors are very sensitive about not wanting to make a change, even if the market data would support it, not wanting to increase their own pay if the company's stock price performance hasn't been good, or their financial performance hasn't been good, So there are a few kind of external factors that play into the timing of that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jen. I think that your comment earlier about a 20% because they didn't get an annual increase to all of a sudden they're going to gather it all together and give them 20. And that could be, really a disaster from a public relations point of view. I think directors are very sensitive about what kind of increases they consider, what they actually give, and I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, I agree. It's always awkward when you're kind of setting your own compensation levels. So let's see what the people on the line had to say. So this is a little surprising to me. So the about 36% of people on the line haven't made changes to their comp program in over 3 years. The second most prevalent answer was they've made changes just recently. So kind of really all over the board here with these answers.
Well, but if you think about it, so I mean, you do have kind of some people who, a third of the companies who are in that, more than 3 years, but the other ones you would expect the last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago to be relatively similar because that would suggest that, a third of the companies are changing their pay every 3 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. What this suggests, though, to your point, Tim, is that what we've always kind of in our minds used as a kind of every 3 year benchmark, maybe stretching out a little bit longer in reality. That in fact, if you were to kind of expand this question and say, has it been 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years? You'd see that the distribution actually goes out further than just once every 3 years now.
Right.
But interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move to the next slide where we're going to look at the mix of pay elements that make up the director compensation package. And there's no real surprise here, and we've seen this over the past several years. Full value stock or full value shares makes up the largest portion of total pay. The focus on equity usage in general, so that would be the full value shares and stock options. You'll notice that all equity makes up at least 50% of the total pay package for each size bucket, and the percentage that it makes up actually increases with company size. The exception is the micro companies, but we still notice that equity makes up about 44% of that total package. And similar to the prior years and a trend that we talked about a few slides ago, board meeting fees and committee pay remain the smallest portion of total compensation. On the next few slides, we'll look into equity granting practices. And so as most of us or all of us are aware, it's an NACD leading practice to have at least 50% of total compensation paid in the form of equity. And we're looking at here on this slide is the percentage of companies that comply with this practice. We see that 68% of all companies do provide at least 50% of their total direct compensation in the form of equity. And once again, the prevalence of companies doing so increases by company size. So we have about 87% of top 200 companies provide at least 50% of their pay in total equity. And then in the micro companies, we have just under half of companies that do so. When we look at the year-over-year trends, year-over-year we see that with the exception of median companies and top 200 companies, we see an increase in the companies that are providing at least 50% of their pay in equity. Looking further into equity granting practices, Once again, no real surprise here. Full value shares continue to be largely preferred over stock options. And in fact, when we look at the prevalence data from last year, we actually saw some minor increases in the prevalence of full value shares across all size categories. The common rationale out there, whether some of us agree with it or not, is that full value shares tend to create a stronger alignment between director and shareholder interests, with the thought that the key responsibilities of a board member are to be focused on company oversight and governance. When we look at the types of companies that tend to provide stock options tend to be more prevalent among smaller startup type companies where stock options are also have a strong focus in their executive compensation program. So we think of industries such as the pharmaceutical industry, the technology industry, and other growth type industries.
Tim, a question has come in from one of our participants in the audience. Kind of in this line, do you see more boards allowing for acceleration of equity vesting at retirement as a way to mitigate the process of recruiting new directors and allowing directors whose skills aren't as relevant to leave the board?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we touched. Oh, go ahead, Jan.
No, you go first.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's one of the things we discussed earlier. We do see more and more companies accelerating equity vesting at the time of retirement to promote board refreshment.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's if part of this very large shift away from options into full value, maybe even subliminally, is to also help create that ability to refresh your board.
Maybe a little bit. I think the other thing that plays into this is where I think maybe that issue of, and we saw it earlier around, how few companies said that they provide accelerated vesting on equity at retirement. That number may be a little kind of understated, because in the same way that we saw kind of a governance rationale, a good governance rationale around the explanation for why full value shares make more sense for directors than options do. It confers direct ownership immediately. It has, it aligns better with shareholder interests, et cetera. There is a similar kind of good governance theory around vesting for director equity that says that director equity should not have multi-year vesting the way executive equity does, because the equity is being given for two different purposes. You give directors equity to align their interests with the shareholders that they're representing. You give executives equity both for that purpose, but also you give executives equity for retention purposes. You don't have a retention issue with directors. In fact, if anything, given our earlier conversation, you've got the opposite problem with directors. So the governance rationale is that, in fact, director equity should have very minimal kind of one-year vesting. So if you've moved to a declassified board where you are serving a one-year term, your equity should have a one-year vest to it concurrent with the term that you have been elected to serve. And if you only get a one-year term, then you don't really need to accelerate vesting at equity, because you're going to serve out your term and you're going to get what you were granted for that term anyway. So I think for a lot of companies, the accelerated vesting may not show up in some of the data because it's just not an issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
Just a question that came in that may be helpful to others in our audience. Would you just quickly explain what we mean by full value stock? I think everybody understands the stock options, but full value or restricted stock units, those 2 points.
So and full value shares or restricted stock units are the same thing. They're a grant of equity that was given to you that you don't have to pay any money for. So you are granted something that has at full value. We use that term as in our consulting practice only because as a way to not confuse restricted stock which is time vested versus performance shares which have performance vesting criteria to them. We would lump those all together as full value. Which is more of a concept for when you're looking at executive pay than when you're looking at director pay, obviously. But so that's why we kind of use the term full value when we're doing this analysis as opposed to restricted stock. But for those of you who are more familiar with the restricted stock term, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right. When we're looking at the prevalence of equity, it's pretty obvious here that the prevalence of granting equity increases with company size. About 86% of micro companies grant equity to their directors, and more than 90% of companies in all other size categories are granting equity. And about 3/4 of all of these companies use a fixed value approach when granting their equity. And just a reminder, when we say fixed value, that means that each year a consistent dollar value is being granted or being delivered to the director so that the number of shares each year changes based on the stock price. So a company that uses a fixed value will state that every year their directors are granted $50,000 in equity. Companies that take a fixed share approach, the number of shares granted is held constant every year, and the actual dollar value of those grants will change based on the stock price. And so a company that uses this approach will say that every year we grant 10,000 shares to our directors. Similar to the rationale for granting full value shares, most companies will use the fixed value approach, and I know we'll have some differing opinions on this, Jan, and I'll ask you to chime in. But I think the common thought is that a fixed value approach is more consistent with the director's responsibilities and plays along with the idea that a director's service isn't more or less valuable based on changes into stock price. But this is a common discussion we have with a lot of our clients.
Yeah, and I get that, and I would be one of the dissenters on this. While I understand that I am paying directors for their service, and I want that ownership level, my personal belief is that fixed value awards, to say a director gets $50,000 worth of equity every single year, no matter what happens to the stock price in that year, I think insulates the directors a little too much from performance. One of the discussions that's come up increasingly frequently over the past, I'd say 4 or 5 years, I hear it more than I used to, and it is often a question that gets asked by activists, by private equity guys, is why don't directors have performance-based pay? Why do they get given everything? Why do they get cash given to them? Why don't they have bonus plans? Why doesn't their equity have performance vesting? And while I'm not a fan of incentive plans for directors, I think that fixed share grants would be a way of having director comp a little more directly tied to how the company's stock performance does. I will counter-argue myself on that one and say that the counter-argument that I hear for retaining the fixed value is that you stay in the middle of the fairway with regard to your compensation grants for directors. And if you've got robust ownership guidelines, the directors are tied to the performance of the stock over the long term through those ownership guidelines. So,
there's one comment that came in again from our participant group that says, unfortunately, talking about the share grant, equity grant, unfortunately we have to pay the income tax when received, sometimes have to sell shares to pay taxes. Jan, at least on one of the boards that I've been on, we gave those equity grants in a way, they were really restricted stock units, and there was no tax implication to us until we, in fact, left the board.
So there's two things. You get taxed. You get taxed on equity on restricted stock when it vests. So you don't get taxed when it's granted to you. You get taxed when it vests. Mm-hmm. But between that granting and that vesting, there are a couple of things that can defer the taxes further. You can either provide the directors with a voluntary deferred compensation plan such that a director could voluntarily choose to defer receipt of that equity until he or she retires from the board. And that would defer the taxes. The only thing you got to recognize is once you make the decision to defer, you can't change your mind. Or alternatively, and again, we'll get to the ownership guidelines for companies that have mandatory deferral. So it's not the director making an election to defer their equity, but it's the company saying you don't have a choice. We are forcing you to defer your equity. The taxes would get deferred on that as well. So taxability is tied to an Internal Revenue Service concept called constructive receipt. And until you are in constructive receipt, which means you have the ability to take the money, you don't have to pay the taxes on it. And after my little tax lesson there, we should probably move on, Tim, because we've got about 12 minutes left, and we need to make sure we get through the rest of the slides.
Yep, so I'll go through these next few slides really quickly because we do want to leave time for Q&A, and we have a couple polling questions. The prevalence of providing any sort of committee pay. And so the general idea here is that the prevalence of providing pay to committee chairs has remained flat over the prior year, so we're not really seeing companies eliminating committee pay to their committee chairs. However, we do see a decrease, and we had discussed this earlier, in the prevalence of providing compensation to committee members, as we saw a decrease almost unanimously across all committees and size categories. I think the idea behind removing member pay is that, being a committee member has really evolved into a typical responsibility or expectation of a board member as we continue to see more and more work being done at the committee level. And so the thought is that compensation being provided to committee members is accounted for in your typical board compensation elements. When looking at the actual levels provided to the chairs of our typical freestanding committees, this has held true for a few years now. there's really universal agreement that the audit chair is the biggest job and therefore receives the most pay, followed by the comp committee chair as the second biggest job, and finally followed by the chair of the nominating or governance committee. And really across the board, if we look at the retainer levels, we see about a 5,000 difference between the audit and the comp committee chair, and between the comp committee chair and the nominating governance committee chair. When we look at member pay, it takes a very similar hierarchical approach as the chair retainers. So audit committee members get paid more than comp committee members, and comp committee members get paid more than nominating governance committee members. You may recall a few years ago we reached the point where the prevalence of providing committee members or members of the compensation and nominating governance committees dropped below 50% among top 200 companies, and so that's why you'll see a median of $0 for those two committees among top 200 companies. And this leads us to our fourth polling question, and I'll turn it over to Jan.
Sorry. So when we think about that committee pay, this is one of the areas, while a lot of compensation for directors has been pretty consistent over the years, this is an area, one of the areas where we are still seeing companies shift. So we wanted to get a sense from the audience how your company pays committee members, not chairs, just members. We pay all committees some kind of fee, and it doesn't really matter at this point, just do you pay for committee membership or not. We only pay audit committee members, not members of other committees. Or third, we don't pay any committee members compensation for their service, just as members on committees. So if we take a few minutes and let people quickly do that, I think this is one of those areas where while certainly we see how the market prevalence is moving, I think Tim made a good point in terms of thinking about the facts and circumstances of your particular company and whether or not committee membership makes sense. While I agree that it is become kind of an expectation that if you're sitting on a board as an independent board member, part of what you're there for is to provide service on one or two committees as well, but that's not always the case. So I think notwithstanding how we see the market trend, if you're a company where there's an unevenness in the distribution of committee work, then I think it probably still makes sense to pay committee member compensation to reflect the fact that you've got a diverse set of board members who maybe aren't necessarily all doing the same amount of work. So I think this can really differ as to whether or not, just because this is one of those areas where just because the market's moving a direction doesn't mean that it's necessarily right for everybody. And let's take a look.
Jan, before you go on to that, there are a few companies that more and more are having other standing committees, and especially like a risk committee. A question from the participants, a couple of them, in fact, wondered if there was any compensation paid to those other less common.
Less prevalent.
Yeah, less prevalent.
Yeah, and so yes, and in terms of the data that we look at, and so when you look at all of the data that's in the report, we actually look at the compensation and service of all committees. So we don't only look at the 3 common standing committees. We look at all compensation for all committees at all companies. We just only show data on the top 3 because all of the other committees are they're just not prevalent enough to have meaningful statistics. I would say that as a general rule, other committees absolutely pay, the one exception being the executive committee, which is kind of a vestige of olden days, and a lot of committees have even gotten rid of those. But if you think the board, my sense is if the board has enough issue where they think there's an issue that requires the creation of a special committee, if it's important enough to have created a committee, then it's important enough to pay people to do the work.
Good point.
And in general, I would say that unless it is unless it's a committee where there's just an enormous amount of heavy lifting, most extraneous committees tend to pay at either the NomGov level or the comp level. Very few pay their extraneous committees at the audit committee level. So we're running on time, so let me just kind of show these numbers quickly. About 55% of the companies pay all of their committee members. 40% pay none of their committee members. So the audience is kind of consistent with what we're seeing in the market in terms of change. I want to do a quick poll on for just those 55% that pay their committee members. Do you pay an annual retainer only? Do you still pay meeting fees, or do you pay both a combination of annual retainer and meeting fees? So only the people who pay obviously would answer this. Again, for your committee members, we'll do this quickly, and then we've got a couple little wrap-up slides.
And Jan, while we're waiting for that, a comment from the audience again. Since governance issues are increasingly important, should the chair of that committee still get paid the least?
That's really interesting. And, we saw this happen. If you go back in time, it used to be the committees all got paid the same, even audit committees. And then we had Sarbanes-Oxley, and audit committee chairs and audit committee members said, this is crazy. We're working twice as hard as everybody else. We've got all this stuff we have to go through. We should get paid more money. And you created a two-tiered system where there was the audit committee and then there was everybody else. And then you got all of the stuff around CEO compensation and revised proxy and proxy statements and CD&As and all this stuff. And the comp committee and the comp committee chair raised their hands and said, hey, wait a minute, we're the ones that now have, targets on our foreheads. We should get paid more. And that created the three-tier system, the audit committee, the comp committee, and then everybody else. And I would say there's a reasonable argument to say that, NomGov is now under a lot more, is doing a lot more heavy lifting than what they used to. And in a funny kind of way, you wonder if this doesn't have the pendulum swinging back to the future to say, you know what, maybe we don't need differentiation between our committees at all. Maybe we say, everybody's doing work, everybody's got their own challenges and issues, and maybe we don't need differentiated committee pay at all anymore.
Let's go on to our answers.
How that plays out. Just under half pay a retainer only. About 20% pay meeting fees only, and about 35% pay retainer and meeting fees. So kind of a mishmash in terms of how folks are paid. Quickly, I want to touch briefly on executive leadership, or kind of the board leadership. So you've got non-executive chairs, lead directors, where you've got a combined CEO chairman of the board, you have a lead director. Here, this data hasn't changed a lot year over year. The majority of companies do provide compensation for those positions. Non-executive chairs tend to get about a 50% premium over what a regular board member gets. A lead director or presiding director tends to get about 10 or 11% premium over what a regular board member gets. Interestingly, those premiums don't really seem to be particularly size dependent. They tend to be pretty consistent across all the different sizes. The last piece of data that we want to talk about, and Richard, you've been kind of weaving this through all the way through, is ownership guidelines. Again, the majority of companies have ownership guidelines. Even at the smallest companies, so those companies with less than $500 million in revenues, are now at a 50% of companies have some form of ownership guideline, either a multiple of retainer guideline or a dollar-based guideline or a share-based guideline, but some kind of a requirement that the directors hold on to some portion of the equity they've been granted. To your comment, Richard, earlier about actually forcing directors to hold on to shares for some period of time or hold to retirement, that is still a fairly modest or minority practice. We don't see most companies put in their ownership guideline and call it a day. There are some companies who take more of a belts and suspenders approach and say, not only do you have to hold X number of shares, but even beyond that X number of shares, we're going to make you hold on to some percentage of all of the equity we give you until such time as you retire. And with that, I am 2 minutes. My clock shows me being 2 minutes over my time. This is one of those areas where there's, the data, the raw data doesn't move much year to year. People are pretty conservative and careful about director compensation, so companies don't make lots of big changes. But there are things to pay attention to at the margins just to make sure that you don't kind of, inadvertently have a misstep on this. This is one area, as we were saying earlier, this is one area where you don't want to have an unforced error. I know there have been some questions during the talk. We will come back and respond via email to people's questions. So if we didn't get to the question online today, we will get to your questions. You will get an email from Tim or from me responding to your questions. And I guess, Ronell, I need to turn it over to you.
Yes, Ronell, I think it's your turn.
All right, thank you, Richard. Richard, did you want to say a few thanks to the audience for us?
Only that I'll just reconfirm what Jan said. Those questions that did not get answered, responded to, you will, in fact, get an answer from Tim or Jan in the not-too-distant future. We really thank you for your participation and putting your questions in and being a part of this webinar.